Hello, and welcome back to another day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. Today we are diving into black. We are doing a deck building toolbox guide. So this is sort of a crafting guide, but really what I want you to do is to put your thinking cap on as I talk about these cards and decide which of them are the ones that you would really like to craft. The idea is to give you a toolbox of cards to let you build a variety of different archetypes. So, we're starting with commons and uncommons here. We'll dive right in. So Annihilating Glare is a new card in Phyrexia, all will be one. The reason I mention it here is to let you know that there is a better card in Standard currently. It's called Eaten Alive. Other than the fact that if you cast the extra cost with Eaten Alive with mana, it takes double black in that case. Eaten Alive does an exile effect, whereas Annihilating Glare only does a destroy effect. So if you're choosing between these spells for your, it could be an Aristocrats pile, you could just run one or two just to have the effect in any deck. You might be willing to spare a creature if the opponent's threat is bad enough, or spare the 5 mana. Eaten Alive is the better card. It will rotate out of Standard sooner than Annihilating Glare, however. Bilious Skull Dweller. This is a cheap Death Touch creature. It also has Toxic. So it kills the opponent at least twice as fast as damage. The reason I say at least is because your opponent could gain life. So damage is not always a sure thing. They don't always just have 20 life. Poison counters are much harder to disrupt. There is one card in all of Standard that interacts with poison in any way to prevent it. Also, as a 1-mana Death Touch creature, this trades very nicely with aggro and mid-range creatures. So it can serve a variety of roles for your deck. If you want it, go ahead and craft it. Blood Fountain. You might have some copies of this already. I know I do. Between the new player decks and the jump-in events that I've done, I think one copy of Blood Fountain is an excellent inclusion for Rakdos Anvil decks. They do run creatures like Blood Tithe Harvester that you would be happy to get 2 copies of back from your graveyard. The Blood Fountain comes down as 2 artifacts on turn 1, so if you follow up on turn 2 with the Anvil, then you have plenty of fodder ready for your Anvil. You're already turning on your strategy. Now you probably don't want 2 to 4 copies of Blood Fountain. It's not that good. But for that particular deck, I wanted to call it out here as a one-of. Cult Conscript. This is a great card. If you want to send your deck a little bit more in an aggro direction, a 2-1 for 1 that can potentially keep coming back from the graveyard, that's a great include. Puts lots of pressure on the opponent, can keep giving you a sort of card advantage through the recursion it gets over a long game. Overall, not bad. Totally decent card. I happen to have 4 copies of it. Maybe you do too. If you took jump-in packets, maybe it even comes with new player decks. Just keep it in mind. Would also be a decent role player in an Aristocrats deck, a mid-range deck. Doesn't just have to be aggro. Cut Down is one of the best pieces of removal in Standard at the moment, at least for Best of 1, because Best of 1 is a bit overrun with red decks and soldier decks. And you will find plenty of targets for Cut Down. If you look more towards mid-range decks, Cut Down will destroy either side of Fable of the Mirror Breaker. If you only have the one piece of removal, it's more important to deal with the Kiki Jiki on the back side. But sometimes you want to kill the goblin on the front side so they don't get a mana advantage. Life is hard. Cut down is good, though. Disfigure is not as good as Cut Down. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Disfigure is a perfectly serviceable removal spell, but it's not as good as Cut Down. But if you already have 4 copies of Cut Down, and you hate losing to aggro decks, you might have a sort of a 5th and 6th copy of Cut Down in the form of Disfigure. Because of cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, you will tend to find targets for the Disfigure. And it can kill things that the Cut Down does not. There are some small white creatures that can gain indestructible. Disfigure would kill those where Cut Down would not. Anyway, 1 or 2 copies of Disfigure after you've done your playset of Cut Down is totally reasonable if you want to run that much 1-mana removal. Dockside Chef. It's not great in multiples, but 1 copy of this in an Aristocrats deck turns on your sacrifice outlet, draws you cards. As a 1-2 for 1, it's not going to impress anyone. It's not bad either. This is mostly specifically for an Aristocrats build. I mentioned it here. And I'm not sure how many more than 1 copy you want. Duress. It's a big question whether you want to run Duress in Best of 1 Standard. It's a great sideboard card in Best of 3. Some people do run this main deck in Best of 1. I could certainly see running a singleton copy of Duress. In Best of 1, I don't know if I would go in for more than the singleton copy, because there will be matchups where it's sort of a dead card. You know, you'll probably hit something against a mono-red player, but against soldiers, their entire hand might just be creatures. Or the Legends deck might have a hand that's all creatures. Eaten Alive, as I mentioned earlier, this is good for an Aristocrats build. It's also fairly serviceable as a one-of in any black deck. There are times that it's worth it to sacrifice your creature to deal with the board. There are also times it's worth it to pay 5 mana. If it's not an Aristocrats deck, you might not want more than 1 copy. But keep it in mind, it exiles things. That's hard to get a hold of. Gnawing Vermin. So this is good in a self-mill strategy. That could be mono-black, that could be black-green. Black-green loves to do that. Gnawing Vermin trades up with 2-drops because of its death trigger. It could also trade with a pair of 1/1s. Overall, as far as 1-drops go, this is a good card. Goes well in Aristocrats, goes well in Mill, and there's Charismonics, the rare. I'm not recommending you craft Charismonics, but if you have your heart set on the rat deck, this is a good rat for it. Overall, not a bad card. Akiba Reckoner Raid. If you want an aggressive slant to your black deck, or if you want to go for a black burn deck, where you top out with spells like Invoke Despair and Corrupt up on the top end to just deal damage to the face to kill your opponent. Starting in the early game with Akiba Reckoner Raid, gains you 2, loses them 2. You get a 2/2 with Menace, and if you were in my colorless crafting guide, vehicles you control have Menace. This will give your Reckoner Bankbusters Menace. It's good, it comes up. As for me. If you want it, you might end up crafting all 4. Persistent Specimen. So for an Aristocrats deck, most people probably wouldn't take this card seriously, and I don't know that you would ever want 2 copies of it. I could imagine a board state where you have 6 mana and you're returning 2 copies of this from the graveyard. But mostly, because it's mana intensive, mostly I see this card being effective as a 1-of. It works reasonably well for me as a 1-of in various Aristocrats piles. With 1 copy, I don't think you'll be sad you have it. Undying Malice. There are various effects like this at the 2 mana mark. This one is a 1 mana spell that when the creature dies, it comes back to the battlefield, and that is sort of like flickering it. So what some black decks like to do with Undying Malice is, let's say you've got a prototype creature. You've got your 3/3 lifelink menace artifact. You've got a mana open. The opponent goes to deal with it. You cast Undying Malice. Now it comes back, not as the prototype side, but as the full-sized side with a +1 counter. And that's a pretty back-breaking play. Undying Malice is kind of a gotcha card. You probably don't want all 4. But 1 copy, I think, can be a heck of a trick. Anoint with Affliction. So since this is a general purpose crafting guide, and I'm not just assuming you're doing this for a poison deck, I would like to point out that this is a 2-mana instant that exiles a creature with mana value 3 or less. Most of the most dangerous creatures that you will come up against in Best of 1 are 3 mana or less. Some of the very worst, very nastiest things you'll face are at that mana value. And Anoint with Affliction will deal with them at instant speed and exile them. I think 1 or 2 copies of this spell are worth it, even for a deck that cannot turn on the Corrupted. Now this makes it a little niche. This means you probably don't want all 4 copies in case you're up against a control deck that has big finishers, or a ramp deck. Although even against a ramp deck you might hit their mana creatures with this, and that's also worth doing. Anyway, good piece of removal. Drown in Ichor. So this is a proliferate card. There's all kinds of incidental counters. You can build your deck to take advantage of this, in which case you might lean towards Drown in Ichor more than you would, say, Go for the Throat or Infernal Grasp. If you can take advantage of the proliferate. -4/-4 does get around indestructible, however it does not kill larger creatures in the format, such as Shuldred. So decide for yourself if this effect is worth it for your deck. Also, this is sorcery speed, and that is a major downside compared to Go for the Throat and Infernal Grasp. Still, this will kill most things you pointed at. Ghoulish Procession. I won't tell you to craft this card, but if you like brewing around Aristocrats piles, this is fun. I've had lots of fun with this card over its run in Standard. When I kind of came back to Arena and I was building various decks, Ghoulish Procession featured in a lot of them. It can trigger on the opponent's turn and your turn, so combos with your creatures and the opponent's creatures. You can build up a wide board the opponent can't deal with, and once you've built around the synergy of having these creature tokens in the deck, you could, sacrifice them to Dockside Chef, or you could sacrifice them to Reckoner's Bargain. There are various ways that you can take advantage of it. Or, sacrifice it to Morkrut Behemoth, Ravenous Necro Titan. The list goes on. Anyway, it's a fun card to try in Aristocrats piles. You may not want all 4 copies, but 3, if you're really, really into this effect and this card, 3 copies will probably serve you quite well. 4, the Shuffler will make sure you draw 4 copies, which might not be what you want. So, go for the Throat, one of the best pieces of removal in Standard. Unfortunately, I can't recommend all 4 of them, because some of the best creatures in Standard are artifact creatures. So I think 2 to 3 copies of Go for the Throat is the correct call for most decks. Being at this, cheap point of mana, it's good for aggro, it's good for mid-range, good for control. Good pretty much wherever you put it. Heirloom Mirror. So, this is another one I won't tell you to craft. It's a little slow for best of 1. You could think of this card as being similar to 3 blood tokens that also mill you 3 cards, lose 3 life, turn into a 4/4 flyer that can keep growing over the course of the game and hate on creature cards in the opponent's graveyard, as well as eat them out of your own to grow. The sorcery speed activation is the real sticking point on this card. If Heirloom Mirror was instant speed to activate, I think it would have been adopted pretty much right away when it came out. As it is, it's still a serviceable card, especially if you're on a very tight budget. 1 or 2 copies of this will smooth out your draws, fill up your graveyard, flip into a win condition. It has a lot of neat tricks that it does. Honestly, the front side of Heirloom Mirror is good enough that when I've used it before, I was sometimes sad when it flipped over because I wanted to keep using the front side of it. Anyway, it's at least worth looking at. Infernal Grasp. This is a bread and butter removal spell, deals with artifact creatures, deals with anything you pointed at. Not as good in aggro matchups because of losing 2 life, but compared to taking damage from a creature with haste that's attacking you, it's still usually a good call to blow that creature up with Infernal Grasp. You might not want all 4, but then again you might, especially if you have a little bit of life gain to offset the Infernal Grasp. It's one of the best pieces of black removal in the format, to this day. It's from the oldest set in Standard, but Infernal Grasp, still worth your time. You might already have it in your collection, I'm just mentioning it here. Knight of Dusk's Shadow. So I've seen a little bit of fringe play of this card when people are making budget black decks. So it's hard to block, has menace. You can pump it up, not as effectively as one of the rares that we're going to look at. Doesn't work as well in multiples because most of the shade type creatures that pump up like this don't work that well in multiples. You need to commit the mana somewhere. You can't commit it to all of them. 1 copy of this, though, I think is a good inclusion in a deck. And the line of text your opponents can't gain life might win you a race, or shut down a control deck in spectacular fashion. One copy is definitely worth considering. Life of Toshiro Umezawa. So again, I think 1 copy of this card is kind of a great gotcha card in most black decks. Once it flips, it can help you cast a large instants and sorceries, so notably it can ramp you up into Invoke Despair or Corrupt. Basically on curve, on time, comes right about the time you need it. If you can hit a soldier or aggro deck with the -1/-1, occasionally you can use it twice to kill 2 of the opponent's creatures. That's obviously fantastic. Oftentimes you can pump one of your own creatures to get in a damage race. And the fail state of the card gaining 2 life twice and then getting a 2/3 that can ramp your mana, for instance in sorceries, that's still a pretty great deal for 2 mana. Overall, Life of Toshiro Umezawa, I think a 1 of, is well worthy of inclusion. Parasitic Grasp. So we're kind of going over all these silver bullet cards here, where if your whole deck is full of them, you might not have the answers you need. But here, 1 copy is probably great against the soldier deck. There's probably a lot of human soldiers in that deck. There are other humans floating around standard, and in the fail case where this is 3 mana, killing something from an aggro deck to gain 3 life, you'd probably still wish it was less mana, but since it gains 3 life, it definitely offsets the added mana cost of casting it. It's just what you want to do against an aggro player. So, 1 copy of Parasitic Grasp, probably a good include in, most decks. Reckoner's Bargain. This is almost strictly for aristocrats, but you can sacrifice an artifact. So 1 or 2 copies could make their way into an anvil deck as well. Possibly some other deck that has not yet been seen. So, sacking something to draw 2 cards, gain some life. Overall, this is a completely fair Magic card. It's not going to knock anyone's socks off, but it could be what your deck wants. Keep it in mind. Sheoldred's Edict. So filling up your toolbox here with various removal spells, I think 2 copies of Sheoldred's Edict is going to be great for just about any deck that can cast it. It's an answer to Planeswalkers. And the modality between creatures and token creatures and non-token creatures means that very often it can hit what you want it to hit. On an empty board, Titan of Industry comes down, makes a 4/4, gives itself a shield counter. The Sheoldred's Edict can make sure the Titan of Industry dies. Now, there are some times where edicts, sacrifice effects, are not as good if your opponent's going wide with tokens. Still, with the flexible modes on this card, and the ability to hit Planeswalkers for 2 mana, I think you're going to want at least 2 copies of Sheoldred's Edict. Alright, Transmogrant Altar. So we're talking about aristocrats here. I don't know that you want 2 to 4 copies of Transmogrant Altar, but if you do have an aristocrats deck, then this can either be a mana ramp piece, or it can start converting your creatures into 3/3s. And a 3/3 artifact creature, it dodges Cut Down, right? Dodges Disfigure, dodges Go for the Throat, so it avoids a lot of the best removal in Standard to make a 3/3 artifact creature. So I think having 1 copy of this card in an Aristocrats deck seems like a great thing to try. I would absolutely love to see this start working with Ghoulish Procession and start turning your 2/2 decayed zombie tokens into 3/3 artifact zombies. That sounds pretty amazing. Right, Blood Pact. We're going to look at a couple of black card draw spells here. They're not the best, but they're not the worst either. Blood Pact being an instant. Sometimes this basic effect right here is what a control deck wants. Mid-range decks usually try to get their value on the battlefield somehow. They don't often run straight card draw effects like this, but they could. An aggro deck usually doesn't run effects like this. An aggro deck could maybe run a one-of to keep themselves from running out of steam. Control is probably the place this would pop up the most. You don't want 4 of them, I think, but this can fill a spot in a deck that doesn't have access to blue, where you really want to draw cards. Debt to the Kami. I think 1 or 2 copies of this spell can be pretty good, especially right at the moment in Standard. Exile effects are rare. This does not target, so you could potentially kill, let's say, a Venerated Rock Priest without actually targeting it in any way. It's like the opponent sacrificed it, except they have to exile it. Can also hit an enchantment. So if you have the 3 mana open, the opponent goes for, Wedding Announcement. You can debt to the Kami and keep them from getting any value out of that enchantment at instant speed. Again, edict effects like this are not always the best. You don't want to overload on them. But 1 or 2 could really get your opponent from out of nowhere. They could be, sitting waiting with an Undying Malice for your removal spell. Then you hit them with debt to the Kami, and they just hate the world. Anyway. Felstinger. I know I'm talking about aristocrats a lot. I like aristocrats. This is my channel. I'll talk about aristocrats. Felstinger is a great card. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care if it's fallen off the radar in Standard. I don't care if it dies to a cutdown. Felstinger is a great card. So it has Death Touch, so it can trade with almost anything in combat. And it has a sacrifice outlet with built-in card advantage. So if you don't have creatures, you might want to do a Blood Pact. But even with that being said, Felstinger at sorcery speed could just sacrifice itself to draw you 2 cards and lose you 2 life. So you can just use Felstinger as a spell. The opponent can stop that by using a removal spell on the Felstinger as soon as you play it. So if it's the only creature you control, you won't get this effect. Also, I think Felstinger might need to be on the battlefield to get the benefit of the exploit. But anyway, overall, for an aristocrats build, if you want to get tinkering with Ghoulish Procession and some of the other cards I've mentioned, Felstinger is a great sacrifice outlet for that deck. And it's a great threat and a great blocker to put on the battlefield. Alright, pointed discussion. I don't know that you actually want to craft this card. I just wanted to point out the fact that this, draws you 2 cards, loses you 2 life, has some of that same value as Blood Pact, but then pointed discussion makes a blood token, so you could think of pointed discussion as sort of being like a modal card where it has the option to draw 3 cards, lose 2 life, discard 1 for 4 mana. And you can break up that mana into different turns using the blood token on a future turn. And the blood token might be useful in a Rakdos Anvil deck. It's an artifact on the field. There are various reasons you might want an artifact token, a blood token, here. And in terms of pure card draw and selection, point of discussion, even though its sorcery speed, is technically more powerful than Blood Pact, with a number of cards that you'll see. Hero's Downfall. You don't want to run too many of these. You'd rather have greater mana efficiency with your removal spells. That's the standard we live in. So you'd rather have your cut downs, your disfigures, all the 2 mana removal spells I talked about. But once in a while, you just want a no frills, plain Jane, simple, clean answer to a planeswalker as well as a creature. Hero's Downfall will do that. I think it's totally reasonable to have a one of. And I think you already have this card in your collection, potentially, so. Don't go in for 4 of them, go in for 1 or 2, if you need them. If planeswalkers are what you lose to. Malicious Malfunction. So here I think about 2 copies might be about right. Now, best of 1 standard, one of the things you're most likely to come up against is aggro. You could go up to 4 copies of this effect. And if you do, effects like Malicious Malfunction and Disfigure that lower power and toughness can bring a creature down to the point that a cut down can hit it. Right? If you Disfigure Shouldered, then you can cut it down. If you Malicious Malfunction Shouldered, then you can cut it down. That's not ideal. You don't know that you'll have both of them in your hand. You don't want the card disadvantage of using 2 removal spells on one thing. Once in a while, though, you gotta. So this is anti-aggro tech. A couple of copies will probably do well in best of 1 standard. I recommend it. Whack. This card is whack. Sorry. Most people probably have forgotten about whack. White is a common color that you see right now. So there's a white mid-range kind of value deck that exists. There's also a big white control deck that exists, and there's soldiers, mono white, white blue, which is to say, in best of 1, you probably have a lot of targets for a one-off copy of whack. If you cast this as a 1-mana sorcery, it's going to be great. Imagine killing your opponent's mural, white soldier deck for 1 black mana. That's amazing. That's what you want. However, again, this is kind of a silver bullet card. You probably don't want 2 to 4 of them. I think having 1 copy of whack lurking in your deck is probably just fine. Probably just fine. Casting it for 4 is not the end of the world. Ravenous Necrotitan. I think this card has some chops, not just for corrupted decks, but for aristocrats in general. A 6/6 for 4 where you can turn the downside into possibly an advantage. If you have enough of your deck built around an aristocrat style, creature sacrifice. If you can turn that drawback into potentially an upside. A 6/6 for 4 mana is early enough in the game that a 6/6 could run away with the game. When you get to later turns, 5 mana, 6 mana, you probably want some keywords on your creature. You probably don't want just a big vanilla creature at later mana values. But I think 4 mana, this could still do a good job of winning you the game. Plus, in an aristocrat's pile, This won't be the only thing you have out there. You're going to have lots of other creatures floating in and out of the battlefield to help this Necro Titan out. I think it's worth trying. It's at least worth talking about. Diregraph Horde. When you're drafting Innistrad Midnight Hunt, this is one of the most powerful common cards in the set. As a budget option, I think having 1 or 2 copies of this in your deck as a top end is completely reasonable. Completely reasonable. Putting 7 power on the board could just finish the opponent off. There are ways you can take further advantage of this with deck building synergies in Standard. There's the 2-mana red enchantment, Bitter Reunion. You can sacrifice it to give your creatures haste. So if you have 6 mana and this card comes down and you give them all haste and swing in for 7, that's pretty good. Exiling 2 cards out of the opponent's graveyard could be extremely relevant to the game. And if they have Portal to Phyrexia, exiling 2 creatures out of your graveyard might be relevant to the game. You could also do a zombie strategy. I'm not going to tell you to go out and do a zombie strategy, but if you've got Champion of the Perished, this is 3 zombies entering the battlefield. That would give them 3+1 counters. Something to consider. Girder Goons. The reason I bring this card up is it can have haste. And what haste can do for you is kill an opponent's planeswalker. There are other situations where you also want the haste. Maybe you want to draw the card to get deeper into your deck. It'll still leave behind a tapped 2/2 rogue. There will also be times you want the front side of the card where you don't blitz it. You just want it as a blocker that gives you added value when it dies, and then it's... Again, this is a card that goes well into an aristocrat strategy. Something that's worth noting about all blitz creatures. All blitz creatures combo with Ghoulish Procession, including your opponent's blitz creatures like Tenacious Underdog. Every time they pull out that underdog, you get a zombie with the Ghoulish Procession. You can do the same thing on your turn with cards like Girder Goons. It's a neat interaction. After you've attacked with that Girder Goons, then you'll have the zombie token plus the 2/2 rogue. You still have 4 power on the board. That's neat. Morcrit Behemoth. This is another sacrifice outlet for an aristocrat's deck. You can cast it for 7. And that's worth noting if the opponent has, hit you with all kinds of board sweepers and farewell, and you just can't get anything onto the battlefield. As a late game top deck, this could be a 7-mana 7/6 with Menace, and that would end the game quickly if the opponent doesn't deal with it. Mostly you would only want to run this in, an aristocrat's pile. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies at the 5-mana point. Maybe along with Girder Goons. Give yourself a couple of different options here. It's just a budget option. Something to, mention in the commons and uncommons here. Corrupt. So this is a big top-end finisher for a mono-black deck. It does see some standard play. There are some lists that run it, including mine. I run 2 copies. I found that Corrupt was a little clunky to run 3 or 4 copies. But 2 copies, it works out pretty well along with 4 Invoke Despairs and all of the other cards you might expect to be alongside it. There will be times you have to point this at a creature or a planeswalker, But in those cases, the life gain you get off of this may completely turn around a losing board position to now a situation of parity with the opponent. That's nice. It's not a bad card when you're behind. Cruel Grimnark. Again, I don't know that you should craft this, but it's a common. A 5/5 Death Toucher is nothing to sneeze at. Right? Sheoldred is a 4/5 Death Toucher. Now, Sheoldred wins the game through non-combat damage. This is a common, though. So this enters the battlefield, makes an opponent discard a card, and if they can't, you gain 4 life. So the 4 life gain can be incredibly relevant. If this is, you're going back and forth, fighting against, aggro or mid-range, struggling to take control of the battlefield, you drop a Cruel Grimnark. If they've been top decking, now you gain 4 life. If they've been saving back something, right? You've been at 4 life, they've got 3 damage in their hand, they've been hoping to burn you in the face with it. Cruel Grimnark comes down, now they have this kind of terrible choice of whether to burn you in the face or just discard it. I think any card with a decent enters the battlefield trigger like this is at least worth looking at. It's always worth keeping somewhere in the back of your mind. Cruel Grimnark, along with Duskmangler, you could make a black ramp deck that just goes big. Goes to these big top-end creatures with cool enters the battlefield triggers. And you might be able to outvalue your opponent, even with commons and uncommons. So, Dreadhound has an amazing ability to just win the game. Has to stay alive, but, it's hard to kill. It dodges some of the red deck answers for Sheoldred. The difference between 5 and 6 is, for a red deck, a big difference as to whether or not they'll be able to kill your creature. And Dreadhound can win through non-combat damage. It also makes combat math a little bit excruciating for the opponent. Everything they chump block with loses them life. Everything they kill of yours loses them life. And if they were going to mill themselves for some benefit, that'll lose them life. If you like Dreadhound as a top-end finisher for a deck, probably 2 copies is about right. If you feel that you can make use of it. And Duskmangler. This card has such a powerful enter the battlefield trigger and has such a high mana cost. You might consider not just a ramp deck, but a reanimator deck. It could be worth it to reanimate the Duskmangler. So it does have an additional cost to cast the spell, but if you reanimate it, you're not casting the spell. Isn't that interesting? So if you pull this straight back from the graveyard to the battlefield, you just get that sweet ETB trigger where an opponent sacks a creature, discards a card, and loses 4 life. Which could just win the game. You could burn the opponent out with life loss. If you're going to cast it the fair way, for 7 mana, paying 4 life is the one that doesn't get you card disadvantage. But if you are an Aristocrats deck, then sacrificing a creature might be no big deal to you. Also, there could be times where discarding another swamp out of your hand is whatever. This is a good card. I'd go so far as to call it a very good card. There are a lot of powerful rares and mythics in Standard, but building around Duskmangler is well within reason. It's a great top end. If you're doing a Reanimator or ramp deck, you might want all 4 of them. Now let's get into the juicy cards, the black rares and mythics. Evolved Sleeper. If you play Standard, you already know what this does. But if you're new, this creature grows, and it represents the threat of activation when it's attacking. So if you don't want to pump the mana into it, but your opponent doesn't have a good block if you did, you can attack with it, threaten to pump it up. The opponent lets it through, just deal 1 damage to them, play the card you actually want to cast. This card builds up value in an amazing way over the course of the game. Most 1-drops don't do that. For instance, if you top deck this and you have 7 mana, and you have no other plays, then by the time you say go, pass the turn to your opponent, this will have had the 6 mana for all the activations, and it will be up to the point of a 4/4 Death Toucher that's drawn you a card, and now you're ready to draw 2 more cards the next turn, if they don't kill it. And it has Death Touch, so it can trade with whatever they might want to swing in with on the ground. Evolved Sleeper is a threat unto itself. That's why this card is so good. Depending on how aggressive your deck is, you might want more than 1 copy of this. You'll be happy with 1 copy of this, though. Black Sun's Twilight. This is a new removal spell. It has not totally proven its mettle in Standard yet. My gut instinct is that if you have a little bit slower deck, mid-range control, where you can reasonably reliably get up to 6 mana, then Black Sun's Twilight will be amazing for you. Unlike some of the other lower rarity removal spells we've talked about, aggro probably doesn't want Black Sun's Twilight. They probably want the cheapest, most mana-efficient removal they can get to try to run the opponent out of the game. A black aggro deck is not trying to get the 6 mana. So the real value of this card wouldn't turn on. And it's not a mana-efficient answer as a creature removal spell. It's very good at killing whatever you point it at as long as you have the mana. But the real value here is when you can pull a creature back from the graveyard at the same time. That's when this card is really good. That being said, I think there are enough different decks that probably want the effect that if you craft a copy of this, it'll do good work for you. Fairly confident. March of Wretched Sorrow. The main difference, I'm going to say, between Black Sun's Twilight and the March. Well, there's a couple. So March deals damage. It doesn't get around indestructible for that reason. -X is stronger than damage. Gaining you life can completely turn around a game that you were going to lose. Against an aggro deck, specifically, I think March of Wretched Sorrow is better. Also, because you can exile other cards that are too slow to cast out of your hand to gain you life right now, right when you need it, against the aggro player. You can exile, 2 black cards out of your hand, maybe put 1 mana into this on turn 2. X is 5. Kill the opponent's best creature, gain 5 life. Now you're starting to stabilize against aggro. So March of Wretched Sorrow and Black Sun's Twilight kind of serve different purposes. They're different tools for different situations. I think Black Sun's Twilight is the stronger card in terms of, card advantage it can get you. But the one-of copy of March for the life gain might still make your deck. You might still want it. Transmogrant's Crown. Technically, a non-black deck can play this card. It's not as much of a slam dunk in that case. Playing it for 2 and equipping it for 2 is fair. But once you can equip it for 1 black, it starts to feel more like a really powerful card, a little bit less fair, something that's more of what you want. And in an Aristocrats deck, I know I keep mentioning it, this is a source of card advantage just over the course of the entire game. Imagine throwing this onto a Decayed Zombie token. Attack for 4, whether they block it or not, it dies, you draw a card. That sounds pretty good. But, probably just the 1 copy. I definitely see 1 copy of this being great. Not just in Aristocrats, but maybe even just in a black aggressive deck. As a way to draw you some cards, and force some damage through. Diabolic Intent. This card is a reprint. Tutor effects are very powerful. You probably want this for Historic Brawl. However, I'm going to advocate for it for Best of 1 Standard as well. If you can spare the creature to sacrifice, then this is Demonic Tutor. Need I say more? Okay, to say a little more, maybe you don't go in for all 4 copies of this. Especially if your deck is, maybe a little bit aristocratsy, but not very much. Maybe you don't go in for all 4, maybe you just go in for 1 copy. And you have some silver bullets in your deck you'd really love to fetch up with it. Graph Reaver. Graph Reaver, unironically, is good against aggro, and I feel that I must explain why. When you read the card, you think that it's a weird, narrow piece of anti-planeswalker tech, and that it's bad because it loses you life. But there's this weird irony of Graph Reaver and the life loss of it, where it's actually amazing against aggro. If you play this Graph Reaver on 2 and leave it untapped, right, you stay defensive with it against an aggro deck, like, red or soldier deck. They are forced to deal with this, or you totally blockade the ground. You just shut down the ground game and they have no way of getting through. And if you're doing that, then losing 1 life a turn is vastly, vastly preferable to losing, say, 5 or 7 life a turn, because they cannot make a profitable attack. And the extra point of toughness compared to Tenacious Underdog is entirely relevant. Entirely relevant. So, what I was just saying, about aggro. Red can't deal with this card by pointing a Play with Fire, or a, what's it called? Blessed Flame Bolt or something, that deals 2 damage, exiles a thing. That alone does not get rid of your creature. And if you're able to block, and then they also burn it with a spell, then you've 2 for 1 them. And red might do that in order to just push damage through, but 2 for 1ing them that early in the game and, blocking some damage that would have hit your face, that's not what red wants. And then if they kill it, you don't lose any life. Graph Reaver with 2 toughness, you know, so being a 3/3, also dodges Cut Down. Cut Down doesn't hit a Graph Reaver. If you're against a black aggro deck, they have to point a real piece of removal at the Graph Reaver in order to get through. They can't just cut it down for 1. Graph Reaver, because of this, because it's so good against aggro and because it can pressure control decks, and because it can blow up the planeswalkers of mid-range and control decks, Graph Reaver, surprisingly, turns out to be a fabulous card. It's great. I run this card in my black burn deck, and it does amazing work. It's always good against aggro. So yeah, that 1 life loss a turn thing, don't let that lead you astray. A 3/3 for 2 mana is great. This is a fabulous card. If what you want is a piece of anti-aggro tech that can also be used to pressure a control deck, and you hate planeswalkers, Graph Reaver might be exactly the card you're looking for. Alright, Jadar, Ghoul Caller of Nephalia. So you probably know what Jadar does, but if you don't, he makes a Decayed Zombie token at the beginning of your end step if you don't have any Decayed creatures. So, ironically, Jadar doesn't play that well with the enchantment we were looking at. But Jadar is just generically good on his own if you're not, you know, doing anything with Decayed Zombie tokens otherwise in your deck. So, if Jadar is more your speed, Jadar technically threatens 3 damage a turn as a 2-drop, and provides an endless source of creatures to sacrifice. That will also sacrifice themselves, which can be important for the Transmogrant's Crown. So if you'd rather go with Jadar than with the enchantment, that's fine. You can spend a rare wild card, get this legendary guy, he will serve you well. Misery's Shadow. So this is a shade. It pumps itself up. This is the rare creature that's better than the Knight that we talked about at Uncommon. Misery's Shadow exiles your opponent's creatures when they would die. It's much cheaper to pump the Misery's Shadow with mana. I think those 2 effects are more valuable than the Menace and the opponents can't gain life that's on the Knight. But you might not have 4 copies of Misery's Shadow, or you might not have room for 4 copies. And maybe you would still like the Silver Bullet of the Knight shutting down life gain. So it's not impossible that you might want both cards for your deck. 1 copy of Misery's Shadow just doing this exile effect is a headache for a lot of decks to deal with. Much in the same way that Kumano Face's Kakazan can be a headache for decks. This is even worse, because it doesn't just trigger off of damage, it's just if they would die at all, they get exiled. Tainted Adversary. This is all around solid card. As a 2/3 Death Toucher for 2 mana, this stalls the ground against aggro. Puts at least some pressure onto, control players and other decks. Not bad at 2 mana. At 5 mana, you end up putting 7 power on the board, much like a common that we discussed. Diregraph Horde. It doesn't exile cards like Diregraph Horde, but this has Death Touch, and it can be cast for 2 mana, 5 mana, 8 mana, 11 mana. That extra modality probably makes it the better card compared to the Diregraph Horde. The only reason I would not say so, this is a kind of a narrow case, is if you have a lot of blink effects that do enters the battlefield triggers and you don't have the mana to pay for the Tainted Adversary when it enters. Or, if you specifically like the card Storm the Festival will get more value out of the Diregraph Horde than a Tainted Adversary. But if you have a, Storm the Festival deck, you probably have other more powerful 5-drops you'd rather use than the Diregraph Horde. Anyway, Tainted Adversary is an entirely solid card. It has this neat modality where you can play it at different stages of the game. It's fine. It's fair. I think it goes better into a ramp deck. If you happen to be playing a black-green ramp deck, I think it could be fun to have a Tainted Adversary there. And, cast it for 8 mana, cast it for 11 mana. Get a whole pile of zombie tokens onto the board to win the game with. That sounds like fun. Alright, Tenacious Underdog. This card's value is just through the roof. Just through the roof. Now, I have a couple of copies here. Maybe you do as well. I forget if I got them from Jump In or from the starter decks. I think 2 copies is a really good spot for a deck to have. The reason I'll say 2 copies, there's very much a potential board state you can get into where you're up to 8 mana, you've got 2 underdogs in the graveyard, and you want to use both of them. That can happen. The third underdog, you're starting to not have as much value at that point, once you get to the third one. But any card that can blitz triggers the Ghoulish Procession, the 2-mana enchantment. So if you wanted to go up to 4 copies of Underdog to really pair up with that enchantment, make a Tenacious Underdog Ghoulish Procession deck, it'll work. It'll be good. Haste is good against Planeswalkers. It's just a good card in general. Graveyard Trespasser. This card is everywhere. People have hated it now for a while. It really found a home in mono black, and because people are using their graveyards, it's likely to kind of stick around in standard until it rotates out. It's just a great card. It's a 3/3 for 3. Your opponent needs a real piece of removal to deal with it, and when they do, they have to discard a card to target it. And the Trespasser might have already, triggered and gained you a life and lost the opponent a life and taken a creature out of their graveyard when you first cast it. So this card is good in a variety of situations and decks. In an aggro deck, this is good at pressuring the opponent, has extra life loss that it can cause. Against an aggro deck, it's a good blocker, and it gains you life. In a mid-range deck, this, is a good threat. It's hard to get rid of. Discarding a card for the ward gives you card advantage and gives you a tool to hate on the graveyard. And mid-range decks love having, a toolbox of cards like that. So, Graveyard Trespasser, just good in a variety of situations and decks. You might want it. Shakedown Heavy. This card is not as much of a slam dunk. It's fun. Puts a great deal of pressure on the opponent. The opponent can choose poorly. So, normally people don't like cards that give the opponent choices because that takes some of your agency away. But when the proposition is as good as the Shakedown Heavy, where they either take 6 menace damage or it untaps and you draw a card and now you have it as a blocker. That's very good. Shakedown Heavy also pairs well with a green enchantment called Fight Rigging. So if you get down a Fight Rigging and then you get down a Shakedown Heavy, or you can switch that order as well, then it immediately goes to 7 power, so you can immediately cast Hideaway card on the Fight Rigging. And it does it on curve, basically, being a 3-mana card. I don't think you need 4 copies. I don't even know that you need 1 copy. It's just an interesting card to mention here. Braids, Arisen Nightmare. Now, a lot of people think that you need specifically to build either a Rakdos Anvil or Aristocrats type deck to take advantage of Braids. I think 1 copy of Braids often will find a way to be useful in just about any black deck. There are any number of times where you have a creature that's less valuable than the opponent's, so making the sacrifice puts them in a hard situation where you probably get to draw a card and they lose 2 life. There's also a lot of situations where you could start sacrificing your lands. If you're flooding out, and the opponent has this hard choice to make if they want to sacrifice lands right along with you. I think 1 copy of Braids is more flexible than just in the deck that it gets the most value out of. But the deck it gets the most value out of is when you can sacrifice a permanent type the opponent doesn't possess. If you have a blood token, the opponent doesn't have any artifacts, they are going to lose 2 life, you are going to draw a card. That's what you really want to do with Braids most of the time. I have gotten into some strange games where I was sacrificing creatures and the opponent was sacrificing creatures, and that ended up being the wrong choice for the opponent. That can happen as well. 1 copy of Braids is very good. You might want more than 1 for that specific deck, but at least 1 is excellent in that style of deck, and serviceable even elsewhere. Geth is a more niche card. Gives your other creatures -1/-1, so you can't just slap them into any deck list. He returns creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. He's just Zombify on a stick at sorcery speed. Those creatures will get exiled if they die again. And they'll be -1/-1 smaller because of Geth. But Geth himself is a 3/4, so at least he's a decent body for the mana cost. And a decent blocker, against aggro, mid-range. So if you get to pull off Geth's effect, if you get to, bring your Phyrexian Flesh Gorger, or some of the other big creatures, common and uncommon, we talked about back from the graveyard to the battlefield. If Geth does that even once, the opponent's probably in bad shape. If he starts doing it multiple times, they're probably losing the game. There's also a weird corner case of a kind of deck you could build with Geth. Well, let's take Black-White as an example here. If you put Ambitious Farmhands and the doggy that draws a card, those little 1/1s for 2, if you put those into the deck, they can make early blocks. Then you play Geth, they would die. You can regrow them from the graveyard, they'll die again, but you'll get their Enter the Battlefield trigger again. So then you're using Geth like a card draw engine. It's a little weird, but it's something you could do. I just found it interesting. I don't know that you want to craft one, but if you're interested in a reanimator deck, then crafting one is probably great. He's a great turn 3 play against aggro. They've got to get him out of the way to keep attacking you. Liliana of the Veil. This is a reprinted card. She has proven her worth at various times, different standard formats. One copy of Liliana will serve you just fine. You know, she can be a 3-mana sacrifice spell. Then if she dies, she did her job. If she lives, then you have this, mirrored effect, where you and the opponent are both discarding. Sometimes it's the wrong choice to plus her, and you need to be aware of that. It's also not unreasonable to build up to Liliana's ultimate. If you get to that -6, you probably want to use it immediately. Getting rid of half of their lands, half of their permanents, that's an incredible setback. So if the opponent can't stop her ultimate, you should use it. Don't give them a chance to get rid of her the next turn. I'm not quite as sold on multiple copies of Liliana. Some people love her. I think one copy of Liliana is a good silver bullet type effect. You know, counter as a removal spell for your deck, and if she does more than that as a planeswalker, that's great. Phyrexian Arena. If you're not old enough to remember this card, you might not realize just how powerful it is. You might be saying, oh, you're taking turn 3 off to lose 1 life. The aggro deck will thank you for doing that. Not necessarily. You can be dealing with the early turn plays of the aggro deck, right? You could be using your cut down, your 2 mana kill spells. Maybe you put down some blockers like the Graph Reaver. Then you drop this Phyrexian Arena, and now you're getting deeper into your deck, right? Maybe you've got life gain in there, maybe you've got your one of March of Sorrow, maybe you get Phyrexian Fleshgorger, maybe you get Shouldered the Apocalypse. Turning on this card draw effect means you're churning through your deck twice as fast. Losing 1 life to do this? Wasn't that long ago in Standard I was using Eye of Vecna. I was paying 2 mana, losing 2 life to draw a card on my upkeep. It was not that long ago. This card is just amazing. If you don't believe me, craft a copy and use it, and see what happens. Hostile Negotiations. So this is neat. This is kind of a draw 3, lose 3 at instant speed. The instant speed is nice. You get to play a little head game with the opponent. So that's cool too. I think Hostile Negotiations is a completely fair card. And if you're running kind of a control deck, Hostile Negotiations goes in well if you don't have blue, right? If you're not running the blue card draw spells. You got a black-white control deck, Mardu control deck, something like that. Hostile Negotiations will serve you well. Solid card. Might not want all 4 copies, though. The life loss might add up a little bit too much. Blood Vial Purveyor. This is a heck of a threat. and it's very hard to kill. I mentioned this on another 6 toughness creature earlier. The difference between 5 and 6 matters to a red deck. Their shouldered answers are not necessarily Blood Vial Purveyor answers. Does a very good job of blocking. And even though it piles up blood tokens for your opponent, that ends up being something that kills them if they can't get rid of them. So even though this is printed as a 5/6 flying trampler, which is already not bad, already quite good on rate for 4 mana, just a couple of blood tokens quickens the clock suddenly. Going from 5 power to 7 power, now instead of 4 attacks, it takes 3 attacks to kill the opponent. This card is good. If you like doing a, kind of the either upper range aggro or kind of beat down mid-range type of play, this card will serve you well. It'll quicken the clock, kill the opponent before they know what happened. Not so much for control. Control would rather get value rather than hand out value to the opponent. But I would say this card is solid for the top of the curve of an aggro deck, or a beat down mid-range kind of pile. This card will serve you well. Great craft. Drag to the bottom. This is really kind of a multicolor card. If you happen to have some Streets of New Capenna Tri-lands lying around, then it might not be that hard to hit a high domain count and be able to do a big drag to the bottom. The other neat thing you can do with deck building with this card is rather than choose a wide variety of those different lands, you could make sure that you top out at, 3 basics or 4 basics, so you can tailor exactly how much the maximum minus is. So then you could play cards like Sholdred or Blood Vial Purveyor, where your creatures survive and theirs do not. So I think there's some interesting play with drag to the bottom that you can do. It's not just easy craft like Languish would be, though. It requires some deck building considerations. Alright, Gisa, Glorious Resurrector. 4/4 for 4. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. So Gisa shares company with Misery's Shadow on this exile effect. That can be a pain for your opponent. Gisa has even greater pain in store for them, however. At the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with her onto the battlefield under your control. They gain Decayed. Decayed means they can't block, and after they attack at the at the end of combat, you sacrifice them. I feel like, I don't know, everyone kind of forgot that Gisa existed. Or they decided she wasn't good enough to run as a 4 of, and if you can't use her as a 4 of, you shouldn't use her as a 1 of. Let me just say here that Gisa's amazing. Absolutely amazing. I haven't sat across the table from her much, but when I did, she blew me out. My lord, you should have seen what they did with the board when they got Gisa in play. It was amazing. So, she is not just a solid threat and a solid blocker, and, hates on your opponent's creatures by exiling them. No, in addition to all of that, she has this absurd upside that she does as well. And if the opponent kills Gisa to where you don't get those creatures, they stay exiled, and the opponent never gets them back. So, Gisa, Glorious Resurrector. Oh, and if you do get some of their creatures back with Decayed, they stay on the battlefield even if Gisa dies. You still have them. You could have a Sholdred with Decayed. You can have a Phyrexian Obliterator with Decayed. You can have a Titan of Industry with Decayed. The possibilities. Oh, the possibilities. So I know that Sholdred on 4, followed by Invoke Despair on 5, gains you life when you draw those cards. Also, the opponent, loses life from the Invoke Despair, but that's not because of Sholdred in this case. You gain some life with the Invoke Despair with Sholdred. But if you went Gisa on 4 into Invoke Despair on 5, then you're getting their creatures. Oh, that sounds amazing. The only reason I wouldn't get multiples of Gisa is just because she's legendary. And you might want multiples anyway. This Gisa's so cool. Why doesn't anyone run her? You, out there on the internet, why aren't you using Gisa, Glorious Resurrector? This card's great. Henrika Domnathi. So Henrika reminds me of this show on Netflix. I think it's called Archive 81. Super cool show. If you have not watched it, you're missing out. Go watch it. No, wait, don't tune away from my channel yet, though. Just jot down on a little note card or something. Archive 81, Netflix. Go look it up. If you've seen it, you probably know why Henrika reminds me of the show. There's this kind of Art Deco, mansions of the past, forbidden magic thing with the show that comes up. Anyway, along with Lovecraftian horror and other aspects. Henrika is just this incredible value proposition that if the opponent doesn't kill her at instant speed, she'll trigger right away at the beginning of combat. If you haven't played with Henrika before, she's good. She's very good. She's a fair magic card, but a very good magic card. She can be removal, right? Each player sacrifices a creature. She can be card advantage. Draw a card, lose a life. Well, mostly she replaces herself, but if you get value out of that and value out of the sacrifice, then you will have earned card advantage at that point. And you can also, if you need to, just transform her right away, and she is one heck of a blocker. If an aggro deck can't get rid of her, they can't really attack into her. Not really. And at the very least, she can pump herself on the backside. If you have any other creatures in your deck with Flying Death, Touch, or Lifelink, which is not unreasonable, then she pumps the whole team. There was a time when people were running multiples of Henrika, here and there, in Standard. She never overwhelmed the format, but she always saw some play. And I would wager she's still good to this day. Not a bad use of your mythic. Sholdred the Apocalypse, what can I say? She wins the game on her own. She proves that dies to removal is not a legitimate criticism. She is a 4/5 Death Touch for 4, which is already a perfectly solid on-rate creature for a deck. When you draw a card, you gain 2 life. When an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. She just kills opponents with non-combat damage, and she buys you time against aggro by gaining you life. If you are drawing extra cards, the opponent might just not be able to reach your life total. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Sholdred's good into an Invoke Despair as your follow-up. It's one of the common play patterns of mono black in Standard. Sheoldred is one of the best cards in Standard, kind of butting heads with Fable of the Mirror Breaker and one or two others for that spot. So, obviously, if you craft Sheoldred, she'll do good work for you. She's legendary. Most people run the playset of her because they want to make sure they hit another one if the opponent removes the first one, because Sheoldred kills the opponent so quickly if she's unanswered, that having the other three living in your hand usually does not lose you the game. Okay, occasionally. You know, the shuffler is fine. Maybe there's an occasion where Sheoldred's on the board, the other three in your hand, you needed something else and you lose. Probably doesn't come up too often, though. Certainly, crafting one as a legendary is hard to argue with. Sheoldred's so good. The only reason not to do it is just because you're sick of her. Zoran the Mirthless. Totally solid, respectable planeswalker. Kind of an old-fashioned planeswalker. You know, pluses for card advantage. You lose life when that happens. Minuses to protect himself. Gain a lifelinker when that happens. And an effect that might win you the game with his -7. Deal 13 to any target, gain 13 life. Don't be afraid of using that -7 on a planeswalker or creature if you must. You know, if you can't kill the opponent with that shot, and you can't reasonably follow up next turn to kill the opponent, taking something off the board is better than putting them at 1 or 2 if you don't have some way to kill them the following turn. Sometimes you have to play to your outs if you are just losing the game against them, and your only out is to minus Sorin and hope you hit a corrupt. Yeah, if that's the only out, play to your out. But anyway, Sorin's a good card. Sees play to this day. Planeswalkers are probably going to get a little bit more valuable with Proliferate. Consider crafting them. Phyrexian Obliterator. This has been good in the past. People are trying to make it good again. Whether they succeed remains to be seen. I'm pretty sure the card is good. Right, I'm pretty sure the card is good. If you curve out, you know, with Graph Reaver into Prototype Flesh Gorger into Phyrexian Obliterator, that's a fine board state. Aggro's going to have a heck of a time dealing with you, and they will not be happy to see that Obliterator hit the board. Don't necessarily have to have a fight spell to make it good. If you do go in for the Fight Club deck where you force the trigger, force the opponent to sacrifice permanents, that's fun. I feel like people haven't quite landed on the list that always, you know, gets a good matchup, gets a good win record. But there are people working to solve that problem right now, and they might solve it. Anyway, I think outside of that context, Obliterator is still a good card. You'll still probably be pretty happy with it if you craft it. Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. I have good news. If you have bought the Mastery Pass for Phyrexia All Will Be One, the season we're in right now, costs 3,400 gems. If you have the Mastery Pass, you've unlocked the lower track, and there are these rares that you don't open in booster packs, one for each color. Kinzu is the black one. And once you unlock a certain level on the Mastery Pass, you will receive 4 copies of Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. That's cool. The bad news is if you don't unlock the Mastery Pass and you don't think you're going to be able to get to the gems this season, then you might have to consider spinning a wild card to craft Kinzu, and that would feel probably like a bit of a waste. Probably be kind of a bad feeling. But of those cards that you don't open in booster packs, Kinzu for this set is my favorite. So she's a 5/4 flyer for 5. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, so not the opponent, just your non-token creatures, you can pay 2 life and exile it. If you do, you create a token that's a copy of it that's 1/1 with Toxic 1. That might not sound the most exciting to have this little 1/1 Toxic. Paying 2 life might not sound exciting to you either. A lot of people don't like paying life for effects. This effect is phenomenal. If you play Sheoldred on turn 4 and you play Kinzu on turn 5, and the opponent didn't know what's up, didn't read your card, waited for you to make your play, and then they kill your Sheoldred, then you can pay 2 life and you get a Sheoldred token. And really, the most dangerous part of Sheoldred is not necessarily even her combat stats. It's her life gain and life loss from card draw. There are other creatures that have enter the battlefield effects that could be fabulous with Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. Let's see. Jadar. He's already a 1/1. You'd be happy to make a token copy of Jadar and then have him make more tokens. Graveyard Trespasser? Sure. Sure, we'll keep up the graveyard hate and the life loss, life gain. That sounds good. 1/1 copy of Braids? Why not? Totally legit. 1/1 copy of Geth? Well, at least he doesn't kill himself. Now he can keep reanimating things for you. I mean, if you had Gisa, let's go into Magical Christmas Land here, as some YouTubers like to say that I watch. If you had Gisa on the battlefield, then you have Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. Now you've got these decayed creatures of your opponents that will sacrifice themselves when they attack. You attack with them. Then, when they would die, you pay 2 life. Now you exile them forever, instead of them going back to your opponent's graveyard, and you get a 1/1 token of them, with 1/1 and Toxic 1. That play pattern sounds just absolutely back-breaking. Unbelievable, like the kind of stuff people do with Rata Drabik of Urborg. Kinzu of the Bleak Coven is a rare. She is also legendary. And probably most of you out there will have the Mastery Pass unlocked, or you'll be working very hard to unlock it, like this account is. That probably means most of you out there will wait to get Kinzu off of the bottom track of the Mastery Pass when you unlock it. But if you couldn't wait, or if you're not getting the Mastery Pass, I think one copy of Kinzu, because it's legendary, because she doesn't, work especially well in multiples or anything, I think one copy could be amazing. Because if your opponent doesn't read the card and doesn't realize what this is going to do if they kill one of your other creatures that they think is more threatening, like Sheoldred, they're not going to realize you just get it back. I think this card is good. I really do. I think Kinzu of the Bleak Coven is good. There's only so many 5-mana cards you want to run in a deck, but one, why not? And now Kinzu and Gisa is sounding kind of amazing to me, and I might have to do that. Okay. Gix's Command. So I already have some copies of Gix's Command. I think you either get some with the starter decks, or you get some with jump-in packets, possibly. Or maybe I opened them. Gix's Command is an amazing card. Black doesn't have great sweeper options at the moment. As mentioned, dragged at the bottom is hard to use. You've got a good aggro sweeper at uncommon with a malicious malfunction. And Invoke Despair, if you've been, if you're on curve, you've been blowing up the opponent's things, they're trying to, fight with you to get onto the board, then Invoke Despair is about as good as a sweeper, right? If you're on curve and you've been using spot removal. Otherwise, sometimes Invoke Despair is not that great. If Gix's Command can blow up their biggest creature, destroy each creature with power 2 or less. There are many board states where that is good. There are also many board states where making the opponent sack their biggest creature and returning 2 creature cards from your graveyard is good. Or making them sack their biggest creature, you put 2/+1 counters on a creature and gain lifelink until end of turn. It comes up all the time. These game situations are much more common than some of the other commands in this cycle deal with. It's more generally good than the other commands. I think having 1 or 2 copies of Gix's Command is a great tool to have in your toolbox. Doesn't just have to be for control. It has played very well for me in mid-range. So, Gix's Command, give it a try. Cruelty of Gix. This is a powerful card. Has a ton of card advantage built into it. If you can hit a discard on Chapter 1, then this card is like a 3-for-1 all wrapped up into a bow. The life loss on the second chapter sometimes is not what you want. The easiest way to make sure that your deck can make use of Cruelty of Gix is if you have a Reanimator deck, so you can just go straight to Chapter 3 and reanimate something. And it's fine in that mode. But other decks can want it as well. It can be good to just, start out on Chapter 1 or 2, get there that way. If you craft 1 or 2 copies of this, it'll do perfectly fine work for your deck. Invoke Despair. This is one of the cards people are sick of in Standard. I mean, I loved it when it first came out. I still kind of enjoy it, when I'm the pilot of the spell, kind of hate it when I'm being hit by the spell. It's a little bit overplayed at this point. It's very good. It costs 4 black mana, however. People do find ways of casting this in 2- and 3-color decks. You have to jump through some hoops with your mana base, make some treasure tokens. You have to find a way to get there. But people do. They love their Invoke Despair. It's a powerful card. It can burn the opponent out with damage to the face. So in addition to the value proposition, right, of the opponent sacrificing potentially a creature, potentially an enchantment, potentially a planeswalker, it also might just draw you 3 cards and they lose 6 life. The only time Invoke Despair is bad is kind of a rare board state where the opponent has creature tokens, multiple enchantments, possibly even a planeswalker at low loyalty. So if you hit, 2-3 things of theirs with the Invoke Despair and you're still behind on the board, that's when Invoke Despair is bad. Most of the time that's not the case. Usually you can find a good window to cast the Invoke Despair. It's an incredibly powerful card. The only reason I wouldn't tell you to craft it is either the 4 black mana pips, which limit the number of decks it can go into, or just because, people play it too much and you'd rather see another card. So, Vraska Betrayal Sting. Vraska's a little new. She's shiny. Not literally, but actually maybe a little bit literally. Anyway, people are excited about Vraska because she's this new planeswalker, and she's obviously good. The question is just how good. You can play her for 5 mana if you lose 2 life. She'll only have 4 loyalty. Or she can come down for a whopping 6 mana. If you cast her that way, she could do her -2 3 times in a row, which would just be devastating to try to play through if you're an opposing creature deck and you don't have an answer for Vraska. Having your 3 best creatures turned into treasure tokens is horrible. Her 0 might be one of the most interesting things. Draw a card, lose a life, obviously that's good. That's like Lolth from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. But the Proliferate, that makes this a plus ability. It also makes all your other planeswalkers and things with counters good. I suspect that Vraska is a good card, and that over her time in Standard, she will see plenty of Standard play. I suspect if you craft her, she will do good work for you. No complaints. I think this is a great card. Not sure how great yet. Not sure what the ideal number is that you run in a deck. But definitely worth mentioning here. And this brings us finally to Phyrexian Fleshgorger. This is a prototype creature. You'd really like the ability to cast it for 3 mana, so this effectively makes it a black card. So this is the big mythic card that people like to use, the little common tricks that save a creature from dying and bring it back to the battlefield. There are a couple of those at the 2 mana mark in Standard. The one that I highlighted earlier is 1 mana and puts a counter on it when it comes back. And I know I've sat across the table and been blown out by people doing this trick on the 3/3 prototype, saving it, and then it comes back as an 8/6 with Menace and Lifelink and Ward of paying 8 life. The Fleshgorger is a good card. It's a very good card, even. I don't know for sure that this is what you should do with your Mythic, though. Fleshgorger can go into a variety of decks, I will say that. Right? You can play it on curve for aggro or midrange. It does perfectly serviceable work there as a kind of a headache for aggro decks. They really must get rid of it, because they can't have you blocking with a lifelink creature, especially if it would survive combat. And then they could turn around and race with you pretty effectively and start winning the game. Fleshgorger also does probably just fine in a ramp deck. Ramp up to 7, cast it that way, or you can reanimate it out of the graveyard. That's fine too. Control would probably rather have a little more card advantage from their finisher. But I'd say that at the 7 mana mark, this is not a bad finisher in a control deck. If you have incidentally done some damage to the opponent for some reason with your control deck, and then this is your top-end finisher, the ward can effectively mean it's hexproof, meaning it just can't target it. And if that's the case, hexproof finishers are quite good in control. So it's good. It'll serve you well if you craft it. Despite all that, I don't think I'm going to craft it here. I think I'm more excited about some of the other mythics. So that brings us to the end. I'm going to use 1 rare and 1 mythic here. I want to save some for red and green, and then multicolor. So, one rare, one mythic. Gosh, there's so many amazing, fabulous options here to choose from. But if you were paying attention when I was reading all the cards earlier, you might have realized that I love some of the play patterns of Gisa. Gisa is a serviceable blocker for you against aggro. She is the stuff that dreams are made of in mid-range. And even in a control deck likes to kill their creatures, maybe if they protect Gisa. Maybe this is the control deck's win con. Maybe if you deal with Gisa, they just keep pulling it back out of the graveyard with, you know, Gix's command or whatever. I think Gisa is my choice here, out of all of these amazing cards, as my rare craft. And I am so excited to start brewing with her. Gisa, Glorious Resurrector, you fabulous woman. I am crafting you as my rare. Alright, for the Mythic. This is frankly a hard choice. A lot of colors, you know, all the stuff that I really want is rare and don't really want the Mythics. Black has some really fabulous Mythics. Really worthwhile, good Mythics. So let me see. Tainted Adversary? Not quite what I'm looking for. It'll serve you well if you craft it, though. I think the modality of different mana costs, it always could potentially win you the game. And on 2, it's going to stave off aggro pretty reliably. Good card. Not what I'm crafting here, though. Liliana of the Veil. Great choice. Removal spell attached to a Planeswalker. You know, if you can break the synergy of both players discarding, then she'll do good work for you. Get to her ultimate, you probably just win the game. Hard to come back from that. Henrika. I love this card so much. Henrika's so good. On my other account, I have used her many a time. I don't think you want 4 copies, but 1 copy of Henrika being in your deck is a wonderful option to have. Sheoldred, you know, what can you say? She's Sheoldred. Sorin, fabulous choice. Do good work for you. Phyrexian Obliterator, not just a meme, I think. I think Phyrexian Obliterator's got the chops. I think it'll get there. Might one day get banned. Along with the Vindicator. I mean, really, green and red decks. If you're mono green, mono red, or green red, there's no good answer, really, to Phyrexian Obliterator. You might have to go into artifacts to find a way to deal with it. Because both of those colors use damage. So Phyrexian Obliterator and the Vindicator, they're probably going to show up in a big way in Standard here at some point. Vraska, very nice, very cool option. And the Flesh Gorger. Okay. This is a devilishly hard choice. Probably Sheoldred's the correct answer. Probably. And, you know, serves in basically any deck you want to put her in. Aggro, mid-range, control, whatever. Pretty much good everywhere, all the time, forever, or the end. I'm more interested in Vraska, though, and I'm going to craft Vraska. Vraska, Betrayal's Sting. I still love you even though you've been completed. And in my heart, this storyline will always be fanfiction, and the real storyline you never got completed. Vraska, Betrayal's Sting. I'm crafting you. Alright, that brings us to the end of... If I've brought you any value or entertainment, like and subscribe to my channel. Helps me out. Also, stay cool.